So in section 5, we introduce the for loop, and we, a little bit later on in this section, we'll also return to arrays, even though it's not in the title of the section. So you'll see that even the second bullet talks about array indexing and array assignments and lists and arrays. So we'll get back to that in a moment. So let's just look once again by way of introduction to the by now almost boring example of the constant acceleration. But it's basically the same stuff as before. And here they say we must calculate the displacement of the mass that's falling for 100 different times t between 0 and 6 seconds for the following initial values. S0 is 100 and V0 5 different values, 10 meters per second, 20, 30, 40, and 50. Now, the outcomes of this example is to illustrate a for loop to change the data. Okay, so before we use the for loop, once again, this is an example to show you, in a certain sense, the tedious way of doing it if you were not to use a for loop. So once again, we can, as before, define the function heights. I think it's the same function we've used in the previous section. That will calculate, it actually calculates this S using this formula with the initial values and then time. So, so it calculates that, and in the calculation it actually, or the return statement actually contains the calculation, right? That is valid. In other words, I could have done this calculation and assigned it to a variable inside the function before the return statement, and then I could have returned just the variable. I had a question like that in the tutorial this morning also. But, and that's fine, it's correct. Nobody will complain about it if you do it like that, but you can also do it like this. Right, now, I need to then calculate this for 100 times, and because of that, I define the vector or the array times using the linspace command between 0 and 6 seconds with 100 increments. And then I'm going to call the heights function that I've defined in record 3 to 5 for each different V0 value that I need to calculate. Remember the statement said that we must calculate for these different initial velocities. So I'm going to calculate that. I'm going to call the function repeatedly for the different values of V0. Now, of course, you can do that, but writing the code like this is kind of tedious. And by the way, even if you do it, you can quite easily make an error in writing this code. But okay, it's a written cell, so let's execute this. And so it's completed the execution. Okay, in this case, it doesn't print out the STs. In fact, every time, it's actually a little bit of a stupid example because it doesn't print out the results, one, and secondly, every time it calls in record 9, 10, 11, it redefines ST. So if I now were to print ST right at the end, it will only print out the result of record 13, right? So, but okay, it doesn't matter because we just wanted to make the point that it's a tedious way of doing it. So instead of doing this, we can move to this example where we once again define the same function. Note that I've imported, before I define the function, I've imported numpy as np, so that's part of the main program or the calling program. Like before, I define in record 8 the array times, exactly the same as in the previous cell. What is new though is I now define a second array. Sorry, I must now be careful not to change it. I define a second array in record 9, which I call vinit for initial velocities. And I use the np array command for that. And inside the array, you'll notice are the 5 initial velocities for which I would like to do this calculation. In other words, for each of those, I had a call to the heights function in record 9 to 13 in the previous cell, right? And now this is where we introduce the new concept, namely a for loop. Now, a for loop is a construction in probably all computer languages. The way that it looks like is perhaps different from one computer language to the next. But a for loop really tells the computer to execute the same thing repeatedly with one variable changing all the time. Every time it executes that loop, you can think of it as a loop. Every time it executes the loop, a certain variable has got a different value. And there are different ways of, even in Python, there are different ways to change, to ensure that the value takes on a different value, and not only a different value, but the desired different value each time it goes through the loop. So in a moment we'll see perhaps a more graphical explanation of what this does, but the for loop in this case is records 11, 12, and 13. So since the record 11 starts with 4, it tells Python this is a for loop. And then it v0, so it's for v0. Now this v0 is now the variable that's going to change. Every time it goes through the loop, it'll take on a new value. For v0 in vinit. Now vinit is now the array that was defined in record 9. So it means that the first time it goes through this loop, it will assign v0, it will assign to v0 the first value in vinit, namely 10. The second time it goes through the loop, it'll take 20. The third time it goes through the loop, it'll take 30. So this is one way of writing a for loop where you have the variable in an array. By the way, sorry, I didn't want to do that. By the way, this vinit, in this case it's an array, can be an array, but it can also be a list. It doesn't need to be an array. It can also be a tuple. But it should have, of course, a number of values, because if it just have one value, it will just go through the loop once, and that will be the end of the story. Now note that in the end of this line, there's a colon. It's quite similar to how you defined a function. The function was def function name variables colon. It's the same kind of thing. There must be a colon. If there's no colon, Python will crash and will tell you there's something is wrong. Then once again, you'll see that what is inside the for loop is indented with 4 spaces. So that's also like it was in a function. In the function also, whatever's in the function was indented 4 spaces. Where the indentation stops, that's the end of the function. So in other words, I could have had, after line 13, and we'll see some examples of that. After line 13, I could have had a line 14, which was not indented. And the way that Python would interpret that is that I have the for loop, lines 11, 12, and 13. It will carry through that for loop repetitively until it's done, and then it would have carried on with an unindented line following the for loop. Right. So this is the way that you should understand this. So in this case, it will actually, to explain what this is going to do, it's going to select these values one after the other for v0. It will actually print it to the screen just for us to see that it's actually doing that. And then it'll call the heights function, the same that we had before. And the t is equal to times will still be this long array of 100 values. But every time it calculates st, it will use it for a different value of v0. And so every time it goes through the loop, this st output, or a number that's assigned there, will be an array actually of 100 values, because it corresponds to the 100 different times. Once again, in this example, it's a bit stupid because we don't do anything with this array, but we'll later on today we'll in fact do something with this st. But in any case, so every time it goes through the loop, in this case, it will redefine st to a new array, corresponding to the new v0 value, right? So the only thing that we'll see when we execute this cell is that the value of v0 is changed every time we go through the loop, and in fact we expect 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So let me execute the cell, and if I then scroll down, I see that indeed there I have the 5 values as it executed the loop 5 times. Let me just restart and clear the kernel, because I forgot to do that initially. Okay, that doesn't change anything to what we've done here. Are there any questions about this? Of course, perhaps you don't understand the for loop too well yet. We'll get back to that, but would you like to interrupt me now for something? Everybody happy? Okay, so